Hello, my name is Casey Richardson, and I am a professor of biblical studies at Hope International University. And in this session, we'll be looking at three New Testament letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, three letters that are known collectively as the Pastoral Epistles. Let's begin with some general information, some general observations about these letters. One thing that's noteworthy about these letters is they are written to individuals. Now, this is fairly unusual in the collection of Pauline writings. Typically, Paul writes to churches, not to individuals. Paul's letter to Philemon is the only other letter that is written to an individual. But I think something to keep in mind is that even when Paul writes to individuals, we can assume that the church is reading along with them. These are not private letters in the sense that Paul is simply communicating with an individual. Rather, these are letters written to individuals which deal with matters that are of concern to the entire Christian assembly. So I think we need to read these letters in light of that. They're not simply to individuals. Instead, they're written for the entire church. Paul also writes to people that we know were important co-workers in his ministry, people that we know from other sources. Two letters are written to Timothy. And we know from the book of Acts that Timothy was an important associate of Paul. Timothy joins Paul's mission at the beginning of his second missionary journey. Now, Acts also relates an interesting bit of information about Timothy. His mother was Jewish, but his father was Gentile. And as a result, even though as a young adult he was uncircumcised. And so, as Paul takes him as a co-worker on the second missionary journey, as an act of good faith towards the Jews that he would encounter, he has Timothy circumcised, because technically he should have been, since his mother was Jewish. Paul also mentions Timothy in his own letters, and names him as a co-sender, and perhaps even to a certain extent as a co-author of his two letters to the Thessalonians, his letter to the Philippians, his second letter to the Corinthians, and also in his letter to the Colossians. In these letters we see that Timothy not only traveled with Paul, but also was frequently sent on special missions. A similar situation to what we see in the letters that we're going to be studying today. In 1st and 2nd Timothy, Timothy is Paul's special representative, sent to the city of Ephesus to deal with problems in the church of that city. Now, we know less about Titus. We don't know anything about him from the book of Acts. Titus is named in Paul's letters to the Galatians, and also his second letter to the Corinthians. But Acts doesn't tell us anything about him, so we know less biographical information about him than we do about Timothy. From Galatians we learn that Titus was Greek and accompanied Paul on a visit to Jerusalem, but was not forced to be circumcised. Paul makes a special point about this in Galatians. In 2 Corinthians we find out that Titus was involved in Paul's collection project, the collection of money that Paul was engaged in among the churches of his mission that he was planning to send to the poor in the church of Jerusalem. Titus was one of the ones who helped to gather the funds and also traveled to Jerusalem with Paul to help deliver them. In the letter to Titus, we see that Titus is Paul's special delegate to the network of churches on the island of Crete to provide a structure and order for them. Now, these letters are grouped together and referred to collectively as the Pastoral Epistles because a major concern in them is the issue of leadership and pastoral guidance in the church. Christian ministers are thought of as shepherds to their flocks, and much of the content of these letters has to do with this issue. So Christian leadership is the main concern in these letters, but when examined individually, we see that there are some differences among them. And so now let's briefly look at each of these letters and the historical scenario imagined for each one of them. The situation in 1 Timothy is that Paul has asked Timothy to remain in the city of Ephesus in order to instruct certain people not to teach any different doctrine. He says this in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3. And so right off the bat, right at the beginning of the letter, we see that the main concern in this letter is to curb heresy in the Ephesian church by upholding the authentic Christian gospel. Now, what this false teaching was, we cannot really be certain. There are bits and pieces of evidence in this letter that suggest some of the contents. For example, Paul mentions myths and endless genealogies that promote speculations. He mentions this in chapter 1, verse 4. We also find out that this teaching seems to have had a Jewish element to it, because the false teachers apparently aspired to be teachers of the law, but according to Paul, they didn't really know the law that well, didn't really know what they were talking about. The false teachers also seem to have encouraged their followers to engage in certain ascetic practices by abstaining from certain kinds of food, from wine, and also from sexuality and marriage. Now, who were the leaders of these? Who were these teachers? The teachers of these doctrines seem to be leaders inside the church. I think a good way to imagine the situation probably is a network of house churches in Ephesus. Each house church led by an elder or more than one, some of whom who had gotten caught up in the different alternative teaching and were now teaching it to their house church assemblies. Now, from our modern perspective, we might ask a question: what's the problem with this? Can't Christians have different points of view, different opinions about doctrinal issues? I think the problem in Ephesus was that the alternative teaching was creating division within the church. And I think one of the reasons why it was creating division was because it was advancing an exclusive view of salvation. The view of the false teachers and their followers was that we alone are the truly saved, because we alone have the right ideas, the right doctrines, the correct interpretations of Scripture, the right practices, the right behaviors. And so I think part of what this false teaching was doing was promoting the view that God wants to save the privileged few, not everyone. And so in 1 Timothy, Paul tells Timothy to promote authentic Christian teaching by proclaiming the gospel of Christ. The gospel is the message of what God has done in Christ to save all people. The gospel is not a secret message for the select few, but a public message of salvation for all. Now, it's interesting that throughout 1 Timothy and also in the other pastoral epistles, brief summaries of the gospel appear frequently. And these brief summaries are sort of poetic in form, which suggests maybe that they were hymns or perhaps confessions of faith or something like that would have been familiar to the Christians in Ephesus. And so what we have then in these letters is that interspersed throughout the contents of these letters, Paul provides frequent reminders of the gospel in contrast to the false teachings of these heretics. And I think the point that Paul is trying to make is that the gospel produces a healthy, unified, mission-oriented church. Such a church is a stark contrast to the diseased, divided, and controversy-ridden church that's being created by the instruction of these false teachers. An important idea in 1 Timothy and throughout the pastoral epistles is that the gospel produces good works in the life of the Christian. In other words, adherence to the truth produces good fruit in the life of the church. It's also interesting that in 1 Timothy, the church is pictured as an orderly and unified household. The church is the household of God, and various instructions are given which reflect the nature of the gospel. Instructions concerning how to pray, the selection of church leaders, the expected behaviors of men and women, the proper use of wealth, the proper attitude towards the gifts of creation, and other kinds of instructions that are rooted in the nature of the gospel. And so the point is that an orderly, healthy, unified, and mission-oriented church is what results when Christians adhere to the teaching of the gospel. Now, on the surface, the letter to Titus seems like maybe just a miniature version of 1 Timothy. The letter to Titus also, as does 1 Timothy, express a similar concern with the problem of false teachers. It wants to advance the true gospel It deals with the need to select qualified Christian leaders. But when we examine the letter closely, we see that Titus reflects a somewhat different background situation. In 1 Timothy, the church of Ephesus seems to be well established. There's a church leadership structure already in place. And one of the main concerns is to deal with Christian leaders who are already in positions of leadership, but who have sort of departed from the truth. They've begun to adopt doctrines which are interfering with the church carrying out its mission. In Crete, on the other hand, Titus is, when he receives the letter from Paul, the church is not yet well established. In fact, this seems to be Titus's responsibility there, to help establish a foundation upon which the church can grow and develop. Paul tells Titus in chapter 1, verse 5, "I left you behind in Crete for this reason, that you should put in order what remained to be done, and appoint elders in every town as I directed you." Whereas the church is a church in crisis that needs correction, in Crete we find a church that needs to be established on a solid footing so as to avoid problems in the future. Another difference between the letter to Titus and the letter to Timothy is that in 1 Timothy, the false teaching seems to be coming from already established leaders within the church. In Titus, in contrast, the problem seems to be of rival Jewish missionaries outside the Christian community, who are teaching what Paul refers to as Jewish myths, who are promoting purity and an observance of the law. Now, once again, in this letter, Paul reminds Titus of the gospel, and this gospel provides a foundation for the church and guidelines for proper behavior. Note, for example, the gospel summaries that appear in strategic places in Paul's argument in chapter 2, verses 11 through 14, chapter 3, verses 3 through 7. In chapter 2, 11 through 14, Paul uses the gospel as the basis for instructions about how to behave within the Christian community, how to treat other Christians. And then in chapter 3, verses 3 through 7, Paul uses the gospel as the basis for giving instructions about how to deal with those outside the church, to deal with people in the community around you. Now, the theme of good works also is important in Titus, as it is in 1 Timothy. Christians are encouraged to demonstrate good works to one another within the church and also to those outside the church, to the wider society, both to their rulers and also to their non-Christian peers. In the pastorals, there is a recurring concern about the church's reputation in the eyes of the society around them. The church is not to be a sectarian group which keeps to itself with its strange doctrines and practices. Rather, the church is to make a positive contribution to society, both in its evangelistic outreach efforts, as well as through its good works and acts of service to the world around them. 2 Timothy is also different from the other two. 1 Timothy and Titus have the feel of what some people refer to as church order documents. These are sort of like instruction manuals, which provide guidelines for structuring and governing the Christian community. In contrast, 2 Timothy comes across as much more personal. It's a much more personal kind of letter. In 1 Timothy and Titus, Paul is still on the move, active in his missionary activities. But in 2 Timothy, his situation has changed. Paul is no longer free to move about. Rather, he is in prison, and he seems to expect that his execution is imminent. Now, this provides Paul an opportunity to reflect upon his life's work. In 2 Timothy 4, 6 through 8, Paul writes these words, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time has come for my departure," by which he means his execution. "I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing." Paul is confident that he has lived and served faithfully, and he writes to encourage Timothy to do the same. One of the poignant themes in this letter is that Paul feels all alone. Other co-workers have abandoned him in his time of need, apparently because of the shame and of his suffering and imprisonment. They don't want to be associated with that. Suffering for the sake of the gospel has become too much for them to bear, and so they have given up their commitment to the Christian mission, in which they had been actively engaged prior to that. But Paul writes to Timothy, hoping and praying and encouraging him not to follow the lead of those who have given up, but rather to keep the faith to Paul and also to his mission. Now in this way, 2 Timothy becomes a powerful letter to Christians and Christian leaders of all times and places. In the face of all the struggles and challenges of Christian ministry, Paul asks in this letter, will you remain faithful? Will you follow Paul's example and finish the race and receive the crown that goes to the victor for endurance and faithfulness to the end? 2 Timothy is an encouraging letter, not because it promises that the Christian life will be easy. Rather, in 2 Timothy we find that faithfulness to the gospel is possible in spite of all the challenges that go with it. It can be done. Others have served faithfully. The Christian faith, in fact, provides the necessary resources for endurance. The gospel gives the Christian the courage and strength to make it faithfully to the end. So that was just a brief overview of the contents of each of the letters. Now I want to turn to the issue of authorship, which is controversial, particularly with respect to the pastoral epistles. One of the issues that you will undoubtedly encounter as you begin your study of the pastoral epistles is that in the view of probably the majority of biblical scholars, Paul did not actually write the pastoral epistles. The historical Paul was writing in the middle of the 1st century AD, perhaps from around AD 50 to AD 58 or sometime in that time range. The pastoral epistles, in contrast, many people believe, were actually written in the 2nd century. They were written by an anonymous author who wrote in Paul's name and circulated these letters in Paul's name. And the theory as to why this author would do such a thing is that this author was perhaps dissatisfied with the direction that the Pauline churches were taking, and he felt the need to end these churches. And so he promotes orthodox teaching in these letters. He promotes a stable church leadership structure. He promotes an orderly house church community. He promotes a church that would be well received in the eyes of the society around them, and he's hoping to correct some of the problems that he sees developing. And he tries to accomplish these goals in these letters. Now, why do some scholars think that Paul did not write these letters? Well, the main reason has to do with the fact that when compared with the genuine letters of Paul, the 7 letters that I've included here that the majority of scholars do believe that Paul wrote, that in comparison with those genuine letters, the pastoral epistles have many significant differences. And there are lots of differences that scholars have noted, but let me just mention 3 categories that are of probably the most significance for those who hold the view that Paul did not write the pastoral epistles. One category of difference we would probably call stylistic differences. And these include differences in writing style that can be detected, differences in vocabulary that the author uses in the pastoral epistles. There are many kinds of writing and theological and vocabulary differences that have led many scholars to the conclusion that couldn't be the same author writing the genuine epistles and the pastoral epistles. Another category of difference people see is a difference with regard to church leadership structure. In the pastoral epistles, there seems to be the promotion of a very formal kind of church leadership structure. The author in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1 talks about the episkopos, the overseer. He talks about the diakonos, the servant. And it seems to be that and he talks about the qualification for these leadership positions and those who are chosen for these leadership positions. And it seems like the author is promoting a recognized leadership structure in these churches. And this seems to be different from the authentic letters of Paul, in which the church leadership structure seems to be much looser. Seems to be what we might refer to as more charismatic, meaning that the leadership structure in the genuine letters seems to be the idea that the Holy Spirit is choosing individuals and gifting those individuals for specific leadership functions in the church. It's a much looser kind of structure as compared with the pastoral epistles. A third category of difference that many scholars note is the difference with regard to the view of the author about the role of women in these churches. In the genuine letters of Paul, it seems that Paul assumes that women are going to have leadership positions in the church. Take a look at Romans chapter 16 as an example, to note all the names of women who have leadership functions in Paul's churches. He seems to take this for granted. In the pastoral epistles, in contrast, the role of women is restricted greatly. The author tells women they must be silent. He says that they must not have any kind of teaching or leadership authority over men. And so the role of women is much more restricted as compared to the genuine letters of Paul. And so for these reasons and for others, many have drawn the conclusion that it could not be the same author writing the pastorals as the one who wrote the genuine letters of Paul. Let me just take a moment and make a couple of observations about the issue of authorship. The differences between the pastoral epistles and the genuine letters of Paul are undeniable. But a question we might raise is the only explanation for these differences the fact that a different author wrote each set of documents? Another possible explanation might be that the context dictated these differences. And what I mean by that is maybe Paul was dealing with a particular situation in these letters that forced him to deal with these kinds of issues in a different way. So for example, the issue of a formal church structure. Maybe it looks more formal than the genuine letters of Paul. Perhaps it was the problem of false teaching that dictated to Paul the need for promoting a more formal church structure, to have recognized leaders and teachers in the church to curb the problem of false teaching. The same could probably be said about restrictions on women. Perhaps in this particular church, there is a need to restrict the role of women because in this particular church, these women needed to be reined in because they were a particular problem with regard to promoting and perpetuating the false teaching in this church. So perhaps the role of women needed to be curtailed because of their role in promoting heresy. So it's possible that the situation that was found in these churches demanded that Paul maybe change his view about these issues in response to the problems of these churches. Now, another observation about authorship has to do with the issue of canonicity, and that is the idea of the New Testament canon. The New Testament canon as the authoritative text for the church. And the fact is that the pastoral epistles have been recognized as a part of the authoritative New Testament canon for nearly 20 centuries in the history of the church. And because of that, modern assessments of the authorship of these letters does not change that fact. We still have to take them seriously as part of the Christian canon, as part of the tradition of the church that the church, even in modern times, still needs to deal with. Now, if we come to the conclusion that these letters are contextual, that Paul wrote them, but he was addressing a particular special problem in these churches, then we have to be careful to interpret them in order to draw the principle that can be applied today. Maybe we should not read them as blanket statements that are applied to all churches in all times and places. So when Paul restricts the role of women, maybe it's not for all times and places, but it's in response to a particular situation that Paul finds in these churches. And so we have to read these letters carefully to interpret them in order to find the principle that can be applied in our lives, in our churches today. Now, this has been just a very brief overview of the pastoral epistles, but I just want to take a moment now to summarize and review some of the important things that we've seen here. These are letters that really the primary purpose is to deal with issues of pastoral care in the church, and I think in the same way they can be used in our day today. There's a great emphasis upon the gospel as the basis for authentic Christian doctrine. These letters are controversial for a couple of reasons with regard to the restrictions placed on women. So in our day today, as we interpret them and consider the role of women in churches today, we have to really grapple seriously with the issues in this letter and figure out what these letters say to us today as we interpret them. The issue of Pauline authorship also makes these writings controversial, and I think we need to kind of figure out, is there a contextual explanation perhaps for the differences that we see between these letters and the authentic letters. But I think most of all we see in these letters the importance of a church engaged with its society. That's one of the big themes of these letters, that the church needs to not be sort of isolated and withdrawn, but the church needs to be in its society, sharing the gospel, serving, and edifying the world around us. And I think that's a message for the church of all times and places. Thank you for your attention, and hope this has been a helpful summary and overview of the Pastoral Epistles.